Cool. All right, so WinOps in a secure environment. Before we start, he introduced me a little bit, but who am I? So I'm Dwight Bragdon, like I said, IT security engineer, senior staff for Qualcomm. And for those of you who may not know what Qualcomm is, we're a wireless technology company. So we enable the modern world, right? IoT, cell phones. If it's wireless, there's probably a Qualcomm chip in it, except for the new Apple phones, because we're in a lawsuit, but we're not going to talk about that. So like I said, what do? Work in the Microsoft stack, VMware, Citrix, Nutanix. If it's virtual, if it's got Microsoft on it, I usually have something to do with it. My customers are internal engineers for the cybersecurity division, so we deal with what we would consider slightly more sensitive code, sensitive projects that we don't have on our corporate environment. So why should you listen to me? And that is an excellent question, because I probably don't want to listen to me either. But I've been doing this for 20, 25 years. My WinOps journey has begun probably 3 or 4 years ago, so I'm still kind of a noob at this. And I figure if anybody could do it, or if I could do it, anybody could do it. Right? Even if you're kind of ingrained in some of the older ways of doing stuff, it's easy to change, and I'm going to show you how. So before I talk about how I solve some of those challenges, let's talk about our environment. Environment 1, this is our corporate environment. We consider this non-secure. It's internet connected. Everybody's a local admin on practically everything. We use it for business productivity, time cards, HR information. Yep, very secure. And I joke, the IT folks over on the corporate side, they do a great job of securing the environment, but we don't have control over it. It's connected to the internet. People are local admin. So we kind of consider it the Wild West. Anything could happen. Who knows? Our second environment, which we call the secure enclave, it's not internet connected. Users are not local admins. We use it for business productivity for our internal environment, for mission productivity based on various projects, both for greater Qualcomm and for outside customers. And for those of you familiar with STIGs, these are essentially government guidelines to lock down your environment and if you follow it to the law, you basically might as well have a computer that's turned off. So some challenges there. We're using carbon black high enforcement. For those of you who don't know what carbon black is, it's a application whitelisting, blacklisting app tool. And high enforcement is not a fun place to be in. It's a great place for IT security because they love it. But for end users and for non-IT security folks, high enforcement is kind of a pain to work with. But in our case, it's actually not too bad. And the challenge that we're trying to solve with this one, again, we're not internet connected, so we just can't go to a website and download stuff. Users aren't local admins, so again, they can't just install stuff like they want to. And budgets are shrinking, headcounts are shrinking, so we can't chase all the different engineers and all their different needs. Oh, and the other challenge, for us anyway, is we have multiple non-internet connected environments. And the engineers want everything in each of those environments to look exactly the same as everywhere else. And they also want to act like we're on the internet. They want to act like they're local admins. So can't do all that out of the box. So what kind of things do we do to enable this? The key to this, the core is Chocolatey for business. There are features in open source Chocolatey that you could use, but Chocolatey for business is basically the force multiplier that makes this super easy for everyone. Puppet for software configuration management. Jenkins is our automation server. Gerri for code. And we use Artifactory for our Chocolatey server. And honorable mentions to SCCM, group policy, and task scheduler, which we'll talk about in a minute. And the cool thing about these solutions that you see here is that you don't have to use what you see, right? If you're an Ansible shop, use Ansible. If you're Chef, use Chef. Salt Stack. And today I learned about Otter, use Otter. If you don't like Jenkins, use the other products, which I can't tell you off the top of my head, because when I think of automation, I think of Jenkins. And then obviously the various flavors of Gerri, GitLab, Codebreaker, what's the old Microsoft one? Team Viewer, Team something. And then Again, Artifactory, you don't need to use it. You could use a file share. You could use Chocolatey Simple Server. Lots of different solutions out there available for you. Now, we do have SCCM in our environment. And one of the things when we first started looking at Chocolatey is people ask, well, why don't we just use SCCM? It deploys software, and it does, and it's okay at it. But SCCM is kind of this huge, giant beast that does a lot of things. It's very complicated. I'm sure there's a lot of smart people in the room that could read all the logs and tell me exactly what it's doing every second of the day. But if you ever tried keeping up to date with Firefox and their daily updates, or Chrome and their daily updates, or XYZ software and their updates, SCCM's not very nimble. Sure, it's possible, but it's not very nimble. Really, the only thing we use SCCM for is to install Puppet, but there's other ways to do that too, but it's just easy with SCCM. And we'll talk about group policy and task schedule later. So at a high level, this is kind of our WinOps workflow. This is very simplified. There's a lot of things missing in this. There's no testing in here. There's not a lot of code review in this, but I just kept it simple. And you can make it as secure, as complicated as you want. And I'm not saying complicated in a bad way, because there are a lot of different things that we could improve on it. But this is kind of a stripped down, simple version of how we enable WinOps at Qualcomm. So I'm going to break this down. First part is the Gerri piece. Now this is over on our internet connected site. So pretty simple stuff here. We just have a PowerShell script that internalizes packages based on contents of a text file. Right, so Chocolatey, Chocolatey Agent, Firefox, Google, Pester, whatever. And whenever anybody wants new software to be brought internally, they just do a code review. And since our internal customers are mostly engineers, they're very familiar with this process. But if, say, somebody in finance or legal wants to do this, they're not going to. They're just going to put in a help desk ticket. But then our help desk team could go ahead and do a code review or submit the code for a code review. And the various people look at it, see if it's good, see if it's not, make sure there's a business need, make sure it's not malware, and that sort of thing. Oh, and this package must exist on Chocolatey's site, is where we're polling on the internet connected site. So next kind of kicks over to Jenkins. And I probably should have picked a better color, because on my screen it looks different. So what does Jenkins do? Well, a couple of things. It does builds periodically, daily, weekly. I think we have it set for daily right now. Also builds on a trigger. So when that code is actually merged, it will run the PowerShell job that packages or internalizes all the packages. And then it just pushes it to a file share. So nothing too complicated. I think in the previous talk, there was definitely some more cool things that he was doing with it. In this example, it's kind of a brute force. And what some people do is they get stuck on, well, I want the perfect solution, right? This solution here will just overwrite, or will keep downloading packages from Chocolatey and internalizing them. It's not very smart, but it's a start. So anybody could do it. So next up, it's in our file share. Now we need to bring it inside into our non-internet connected secure enclave. A couple ways to do this. In some of our environments, we cheat a little. I say non-internet connected, but it's just a firewall that blocks it. So we could use different technologies. We're a big NetApp shop, so we could use NetApp one-way snap mirroring to produce a read-only copy on the other side. If you're in the government space, you might be familiar with one-way transfers using data diodes. Very expensive, very hard to get approved by your sponsor. And there's other open source ways to do one-way transfers so that things don't get written the other direction. And the old school method in our environments, we have physical air-gapped networks, and you just need to sneakernet it up there. Nowadays, I guess you could do it on a thumb drive or an external drive. So you move the stuff over, and now what happens? Again, a very simple Jenkins job. Run it after the transfer happens or run it on a schedule. Pulls the packages from the file share and dumps it into Artifactory. Now, I mentioned before you can make this very simple. You could serve Chocolatey packages from a file share. So I don't actually need to put it into Artifactory. So depending on if you have Artifactory, if you don't, if you want to put it in there, if you don't, you could just use the file share itself. It just depends on how fancy you want to be. And we have other stuff going into Artifactory, so it makes sense for us to put it into Artifactory. So, all right, so now it's in Artifactory. Great, right? But now people can start consuming this. A couple ways we could consume it. Puppet, we love Puppet. So if we want to set a specific configuration, we'll have Puppet do this. Simple role, simple profile, role workstation. I wanted to include the profile browsers. Pretty easy, right? Profile browsers. I say, hey, make sure you have Chocolatey. In other areas, I have Chocolatey set as the default provider. And I just say, ensure the latest Firefox, ensure the latest Google Chrome. And so at this point, anytime Firefox and Google Chrome is updated, which is basically daily, if not multiple times a day, it sometimes feels like, my internal networks are now up to date. And of course, as I mentioned before, I'm missing something here, right? There's no testing. What happens if Firefox, what happens if it breaks something? And I think we actually encountered this where Google Chrome's installer is the same name, right? Even the next version is the same name. So, long story short, a lot of bad things were happening, but really at the end of the day, it was only Google Chrome. There's other browsers out there, and people survived. And now people can start installing software. Now, we use the background service, self-service, because people are not administrators. And using the background and self-service, it'll allow people to run as the Chocolatey agent account. So a couple of prereqs, Chocolatey agent, and you need to enable the background service. Easiest way to do this for us is to use Puppet code to enable the agent and enable the arguments to enable the features. And for us, we put this in a variable because we don't necessarily want our entire environment to have the Chocolatey agent installed. We don't want our entire environment to use the background service. So this makes it flexible for us to provide different feature sets to the different roles. And once that's done, self-service. You could use the command line, you could use the GUI, and the crazy part about it is Carbon Black approves Chocolatey. Chocolatey installs everything. You don't have to worry about Carbon Black, which to me saves tons of time arguing back and forth, making sure it's approved, making sure it's, in the proper profiles in the back end and all that fun stuff. So once you add something to Chocolatey, in a way you're kind of bypassing the Carbon Black security, but at the same time, as long as the proper testing is done, as long as the proper CMing is done, it just simplifies the whole process. So that's how we just bring packages from that's available on the internet. Super great, but what happens when you want to install something that's a little different? Maybe you want to install the Citrix receiver with the single sign-on argument, or for some reason you want to use a different application icon. Well, that's when you just create a custom package. And you don't need Chocolatey for Business. You could build the custom package by hand, or you could use Chocolatey for Business, right-click, use the GUI or not, and you're done. A couple of seconds. And the great part about this is that you don't have to be an administrator to create a package. There are some prerequisites. You need to make sure the new file installer folder is present. Here's some files in there that you use as a template for new packages. A couple ways you could do this. You could have an administrator create a package on the computer that the person's using, or you could just write some Puppet code to enable or ensure files are in the right place. So again, kind of a very simple workflow, a lot of pieces missing. You need to do a lot of testing. You need to do some approving. You just don't necessarily want anybody to just to add stuff. But this enables people that are familiar with the tools, such as our engineers, who are demanding of wanting their computer to look like how they want it to look like, and not what their other engineers look like. They're kind of bleeding edge on what's new out there. So any sort of new tool, any sort of new toy, they're able to, instead of saying, hey, IT, why are you 6 months behind the times, right? Why does this take so long to get approved? Why is this that? Why is this that? They could just go in and do a code, submit for a code review, get the package internalized, and brought internally. Or if it's an internal tool or a custom tool, they could create the package themselves, submit it for approval, get it into Artifactory or to your Chocolatey server, and then it becomes available for people to consume. And updates. So if you're using Puppet or some other configuration management tool, updates are very simple, right? You just say ensure latest or whatever it is for your flavor of application. Again, this is simplifying it. You want to make sure you're testing it. You want to make sure it's not going to break your environment. You could also specify a specific version, and once you test a new version, you just change the version on the backend code. Nothing for anybody to do. For the ad hoc installs, obviously sending an email out to your users and saying, hey, please run Chocolatey update all every once in a while. That'd be great, thanks. It's not going to go well. There might be like 1% of the user population that'll say, yep, got it. But they're not going to do it. So very simple. Just create a scheduled task through group policy preferences, or use Puppet code to create the scheduled task. Users won't see the scheduled task, so they can't interact with it. Since they're not admins anyway, they're not going to be able to do anything. So for us, we run this, I think, weekly to make sure that whatever that's being installed by the users are being kept up to date. And there are a couple of limitations in this process. So if you are using background mode, or the background service, you can't call a custom source. I call it a limitation. It's also a feature, right? You don't want users saying, I don't want to install software from the official Chocolatey repo. I want to install software from my homegrown stuff. And I'm bypassing the system because it's background service. No. And we ran into this with some of our Puppet code, which I actually can't recall off the top of my head why I was calling a custom source. But it was actually calling the source. It was just explicitly calling it. And that failed because it was considered calling a custom source. So that will not work. And it doesn't matter if you're an admin. It's just anybody who uses Chocolatey, it gets passed to the background service, and it will just use the source that's configured for you. There is a way around that. You can say administrators don't use the background service. And really, that's kind of your own personal preference. For us, we don't enable that feature because we want both administrators and non-administrators have the same experience and not be able to bypass the workflows that we set up. The other limitations, so with the ad hoc installs, you can't pin anything. And I know you're thinking, why would a user pin something, right? Well, for us, I have an engineering-heavy user base. So they'll probably want to pin something to be in a very specific version to control what they're doing. But in this particular case, there is no pinning. So if things need to be pinned, we'll create a Puppet rule for them, and we can pin things that way. The other thing that people can't do is uninstall, which is probably a good thing. But if a user accidentally installs something and they want it off, which in our case, that has happened, that will involve IT intervention. Let's see. So a couple of key takeaways. WinOps enables everybody, both IT, users. Chocolatey for Business enables the users without compromising security. Turning off local admin probably, it at least halves the footprint that attackers take advantage of. And even though we don't have local admin, even though we're not connected to the internet, we're very paranoid about insider threats, we're paranoid about other attack venues. So giving our users the flexibility and not restricting them too much is kind of a killer that, or is a force multiplier that Chocolatey for Business provides us. And again, this workflow is simple. You could start here or start even simpler. There's pieces here that you could probably remove. There's pieces that you want to add. Takeaway is anybody could do it. It doesn't matter if you're a one-man shop, if you're a 100-man shop, which that might be fun to be in. But like I said, anybody could do it. Start small, add on to it, and enable your users. Do we have any questions? We did bump into the FIPS mode issue. At the end of the day, we decided to not enable it because it didn't really buy us. It was too much work to get it configured. We ended up having to enable FIPS mode after a certain point in time just so it didn't break Chocolatey's functionality in the way that we were trying to use it. To specifically answer your question, there wasn't any specific configuration, I would say, that we needed. FIPS mode was obviously something our IT security people kind of zoomed in on and said, yep, we're going to turn that on. And my recommendation is that before you decide to do that, test it in your environment, see what it does for you. You'll probably find that it's not kind of, doesn't give you the bang for the buck. I'm sorry? These will be posted online, I believe, after the conference. Sir?
So what's your process for verifying? I noticed you had like Notepad++ up there as an example. Do you expect this some sort of audit before you put it in your local repo?
So for our internalized packages, a lot of what this doesn't show is the testing, right? So first, we're going to make sure there's a business need for internalizing it. Then we'll run through some tests. Right now our testing is mostly manual. But one of the things we also test for is that if there's any dependencies, if those dependencies require internet connection for some reason. So we'll bring it internally, test it, make sure it works completely offline without any intervention. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day. I heard Willy Wonka might be around here somewhere, so keep an eye out for him.